Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, another British TV show comes to the big screen, but does absolutely fabulous live up to its name. Not much has changed for publicist Adina, played by Jennifer Saunders, and magazine editor Patsy, played by Joanna Lumley, and during a rough patch for Adina, they learn that Kate Moss has left a PR agency. Unfortunately, while attempting to poach her, Adina accidentally knocks Kate into the Thames, where she drowns, and she becomes the centre of international media attention. Adina and Patsy try to escape to make a new life for themselves in France, and they'll do anything to keep their excessive lifestyle. I have to admit that despite it being a very popular show, I'm not hugely familiar with Absolutely Fabulous. It's definitely something that I've seen a couple of episodes of, but I wouldn't describe myself as a fan of it. In fact, I would probably say that it's more pitched towards the generation before mine more than anything else. The show had its initial run for 3 series between 1992 and 1996, which were praised by critics at the time, but obviously I was far too young to be watching those. The episodes that I remember seeing as a kid were probably the ones from when Saunders revived it the first time around the millennium. They did 2 more series. And most recently they did 3 specials in 2011 and 2012. The most recent one was tied with the 2012 Olympics. And the woman that directed those, Mandy Fletcher, she reprised her duties for this film. And the Ab Fab movie has always been something that's been talked about for a long time. Saunders has been considering it for a while because of the show's popularity, but she's always been daunted by it and ummed and ahed and deferred it. And then her friend and collaborator, Dawn French, made a bet that she wouldn't be able to write a script for it, to just get to actually commit to the idea. And so we've ended up eventually with this film version. And the reason that I bring up those specials in particular is that it has that thing that curses all these film to TV adaptations in that they don't feel like they belong on a cinema screen. They really don't. There are a lot of challenges when adapting a show like Ab Fab to the cinema screen, and the first is that it's not a very plot-driven show to begin with. They were very much secondary to the antics of the 2 lead characters. That's one of the major failings of many TV to film adaptations, is they can't find a way of keeping their momentum up for the entire length of the running time. They always feel like they've burnt out long before the credits have rolled. And unfortunately, Ab Fab does much the same thing. This plotline involving Kate Moss, it's funny as a pitch, but the movie never really commits to it properly. It's sort of an instigating event, but it doesn't go any further than that. It doesn't really know how to drive that forward into somewhere that's more than just an amusing idea, and that's it. Going back to the whole televisual thing, it feels like something that they could have done on the TV show in maybe about a 45-minute or an hour-long special that's been really stretched out, or Botoxed, if you will, to feature length. And that really doesn't do well for timing and rhythm. All the jokes feel off. I think that's partially because the lack of the audience reaction. One of the things that I remember about Ab Fab, the show, is that there's a lot of canned laughter. Whenever they try and adapt a show like that to the big screen, it always feels alien. Watching the gags not generate the laughter in the audio track. It doesn't... You don't get that cue, but it feels like when you're watching Ab Fab the movie, like they're pausing for the laugh track to be there. It's kind of difficult to assess this movie because I'm not quite a newcomer, but I'm not a devotee of the series. I'm kind of in between. But if you were a newcomer, I think you would find it very hard to click with the characters. But if you were a devotee, I'm not sure how much you would appreciate going over the same ground again, because a lot of the Ab Fab movie is going around much of the same sort of jokes that they've done previously on the show. For a movie that was apparently written on a bet, it certainly feels like it. It has all the hallmarks of a rush job. It feels like they had a couple of ideas for a story, but they hadn't really developed them properly. The only reason that this kind of works as well as it does is because of the cast. They've got all the cast members back from the original series. every single main character is here. So obviously we've got Saunders and Lumley, but we've got Julia Sawalha as Safi, we've got Jane Horrocks as Bubbles, we've got June Whitfield, we've got a number of recurring cast members like Kathy Burke and Celia Imrie, and they bring a lot of energy to the characters that the script doesn't provide. This is especially the case when it comes to Joanna Lumley. She is fantastic in this movie. She always has been in this series. She's always been the most hysterical character. She's always stealing scenes because she's always doing something funny in the background, or she's always given some little business to do that's amusing, and it just feels like Lumley is so in touch with what the character should be like that she pretty much dominates the movie, and she's the reason why it works as well as it does, I think. When the series first started, for example, the characters were still trying to reclaim the glory days of their youth. They were meant to be people that were mods in the swinging 60s, and of course 25 years have gone by and they're still doing the same thing. The characters started off in their late 30s or there or so abouts, and now they're in their 60s, and then it starts getting a bit scary, because of course they're still stuck in the same cycle of sort of petty fashions and trying to outwit the aging process. There's this sort of tragic element to the characters now, and I think Saunders aware of that in the way that she's especially written her character in particular. This movie's very much about Adina struggling to come to terms with the fact that she is getting older, she is in some way facing her mortality and her own sense of significance. At the start of the film, she's trying to pitch a sort of tell-all memoir, also biography about herself, but she's basically argued down that she isn't very significant or important, and then the structure of the movie is to try and prove that wrong. And this idea that they're getting older and that's weighing down on them, it's not really funny, and despite its source of pathos, it doesn't really add up to a whole bunch. You could basically do this plot on an earlier episode of Ab Fab and it wouldn't be all that dissimilar. This movie seems to be in a competition with Zoolander 2 over how many cameos you can have in this movie. There are tons of guest performers everywhere, but some of the cameos do hit the spot. The one that I liked the most was probably the one from Jon Hamm. He's only in this movie for around 1 minute, but you really wish that he was in the movie longer, because he's so funny with only a couple of lines that it almost feels like a disappointment when the movie immediately discards Hamm, who is generally considered to be quite a comic talent these days. But you've got other ones from British celebrities, and I really don't know how those are going to translate to American audiences. I don't know if they're going to do a different cut of the movie, because I don't imagine that many of those will be very well known over there. If the same version is playing in the UK as it is in the US, there'll be plenty of American audiences going, well, why does this movie keep cutting to this flamboyant gentleman at the bar in this pink jacket? That's because that's Christopher Biggins. When you have everyone lining up for cameos going, oh, we're so clever, we're so in on the joke, when it's supposed to be satire like Zoolander or like Ab Fab, where it's sort of taking down fashion and the PR industry, when you get all these people lining up to be in your movie, it takes a lot of the teeth away from what you're trying to accomplish. And it's not like Ab Fab in particular has a lot of teeth on that to begin with. I think the reason for a lot of these cameos, though, is that they're trying to accomplish a sense of glamour and celebrity that they really can't achieve elsewhere. Because despite the fact that the movie centres on these characters that inhabit quite this luxurious, expensive world, or at least they attempt to replicate that sort of feeling, the movie's production design and its budget is obviously quite tight. The whole movie, despite being shot in scope, which is like a token attempt to make it look more cinematic, the whole thing looks very televisual, very flatly directed. But what makes it worse, whenever they do have to use some kind of special effects work, it always stands out like a sore thumb. Like the aforementioned Jon Hamm scene, I found myself being distracted by how sloppily the compositing work they did on Jon Hamm was, because they obviously shot him against a green screen because they couldn't shoot at night for whatever reason, or at least it certainly seemed like it, judging by the massive sort of artifacts going on behind him, and I found that really distracting. But easily the worst thing that I can think of on an effects level is near the very end of the movie, where they've taken some stock footage and they've put someone's face on top of it, and it's like they did 5 minutes in After Effects, and maybe not even that. It looks like keyframing in Vegas. It's literally floating on top of the image. And this would have been barely passable by TV production standards on a film that looks atrocious in a cinema. And despite the fact they obviously shot in the south of France, it just feels like point-and-shoot photography. But at the end of the day, what it comes down to is that it just isn't funny enough. Yeah, it's better than most TV to film adaptations, which admittedly is quite a low bar, but even when Saunders having an off day, she's still quite amusing on occasion, but we know she can be so much better than this. And even as someone who isn't a fan of the show, I still felt disappointed by it. This still felt like a letdown. So I can't imagine what people who are much more devoted fans than I am think of this movie. But I was disappointed on another level because this show has quite a large gay fan base. And what surprised me was how many jokes there were at the expense of transgender people. It's like Saunders didn't get the note that we aren't doing those jokes anymore because they're kind of offensive and reductive. There's a moment in Rebel Wilson's guest appearance as an airline hostess where she goes up against Lumley's Patsy, and after that confrontation, she says a line, "I cannot believe we have to serve the transgendered people on these flights." And you could hear a pin drop in the stream that I went to, because no one laughed at that line. Honestly though, that's probably just symptomatic of the fact that there isn't much left for these characters to do by this point, because the series has been running for over a quarter of a century now. It's obviously going to run out of steam. And yeah, there is something to be said of getting together for one last ride, but honestly, I think it is time now for Saunders to hang up these characters. This definitely feels like this probably should be the last we see of Adina and Patsy. Absolutely Fabulous the movie is yet another TV to film adaptation that really has no place being on the cinema screen, and it's sad to report that it suffers from all the usual problems these movies have. The story is threadbare and slapdash, feeling almost thrown together at some points, making this revival feel pointless, and there's a cheap quality to the production that doesn't fit the expensive world these characters inhabit. Instead, the film falls into the same trap as Zoolander 2 by thinking that cameos are themselves amusing, while failing to properly skew the fashion world in the process, running painfully short on laughs with a surprising amount of transphobic gags. There's some amusing moments, mostly thanks to the brilliant Joanna Lumley, but you really expect more from Jennifer Saunders, and it's a disappointment that will likely be most enjoyed by the show's hardcore fans than newcomers. Coming up soon, we play with swallows and Amazons, Kelsey Grammer tries to get his money back in Breaking the Bank, and David Brent trades The Office for Life on the Road. But until then, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.